He says, history stopped in 1936. He says, early in life, I have noticed that no event is ever correctly reported in a newspaper. But in Spain, for the first time, I saw newspaper reports which did not bear any relation to the facts, not even the relationship which is implied in an ordinary lie. I saw great battles reported where there had been no fighting, and complete silence where hundreds of men had been killed. I saw troops who had fought bravely denounced as cowards and traitors, and others who had never seen a shot fired hailed as the heroes of imaginary victories. Heroes of imaginary victories. Heroes of imaginary victories.
Hey, welcome back to Blurry Creatures, a podcast about, you guessed it, creatures. But on Blurry Creatures, we get into realms and we get into places that other creature podcasts are afraid to venture. Talk a lot about spiritual stuff, realms, and we bring on the guests and the experts who push the limits and the boundaries. And we try to find better answers on Blurry Creatures. This week, you'll figure out what I'm talking about. Bringing on Dr. Laura Sanger. She's been on the show many times. If you haven't listened to her episodes, go back and listen to her early episodes. You'll have more context of what's going on in this show. But we love you guys out there. We are super thankful for the growing audience. If this is your first time with us, just know this episode gets a little political. We don't normally do that on Blurry Creatures. Talk about things through the Bible and the biblical lens, and it's creature-based. But this week, it gets a little bit off into those weeds. So if you want to support the show, blurrycreatures.com/members. That's how we keep the lights on here. That's how we do this. And we have shirts back in stock. So if you want a Blurry Creatures shirt, go to blurrycreatures.com/merch. Get yourself a t-shirt. Support the show that way too. We love you guys. Thank you so much for supporting this podcast and sharing it with friends. All right, on to Dr. Laura Sanger.
The history of our Earth is so different from what we can imagine.
The Smithsonian, that if they found out about a large skeleton somewhere, was to go get it.
I'm going to assume at least one person is right, because if one person's right, it busts the paradigm.
It all goes back to the fallen cherub. And the problem with the modern day church, they have a very truncated view of the supernatural.
This backdrop that's just pregnant with all kinds of meaning associated with this Mount Hermon event.
Welcome to Blurry Creatures.
And this guy defects from the kingdom. That's a big deal.
People always ask. You're a fan favorite. People ask for you all the time. Like, when you're bringing back Dr. Laura? And my mom is like, when's Laura coming back?
Oh, yay, Mom!
I know, right?
You are loved on the Blurry Creatures.
Loved in our community.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, we need some female power on Blurry Creatures every so often.
I know. There's a lot of beards. There's a lot of beards and a lot of dudes. That's also
we don't design it that way. It's just there's not a lot of women who as bold as you, Laura. Just get out there and just drop bombs on people. That's why we love you. You're courageous and you speak the truth. And I'm so glad that we took a shot off. Just a shot in the dark on Amazon. Just. This sounds like an interesting book. Let's get her on the show, and
it's so applicable to what's happening. I mean, right now.
I know.
It's crazy.
It is crazy. For sure.
This is great. So we interviewed last night a guy named Dark Waters. It's not his real name, but Dark Waters is YouTube guy who does a bunch of Dogman and Encounter stuff.
Okay.
And he literally brought up the Khazarians last night in our interview.
Oh,
and
wow.
we're like, this is wild, because we're about to talk about it, because he was talking about nobody knows the history there. Nobody knows what's happening in Ukraine. No one knows about the Khazarians and what they used to do and stealing people's names and all these different kind of crazy stuff and I was like, this is too crazy. This is how God works. Which is weird in our show, in our weird little corner of the world here. Things kind of weirdly line up sometimes. And so it's
almost always.
Yeah. So this is pumped. It feels like this is just supposed to happen. And I know that you had said when we were communicating that you had said that like this is something you hadn't talked about, and it just is like, man, for such a time as this, we're excited. So
exactly. Yeah.
Appreciate that. One. And then Nate, do you mind if we do like a proper intro, Laura, and just kick it off? Does that work for you? And then I've got your notes here, but I'm sure you have it. We can just go through, start talking about what we're talking about, and we'll do like we usually do, which is a couple of dumb guys ask questions to smart people, you know?
Welcome back to the show. One of the most requested guest, I think. Sought after. Dr. Laura Sanger. We brought you on several times. You even came on to one of our members' chats, and super kind, super generous, always emailing us back and encouraging us. Thank you for coming back on Blurry Creatures. You're an author, an advocate, and awesome person, and it's cool to...
And a doctor. Very, very, very educated and revered. So
yes.
You know, we always joke, and we were talking about this before we started rolling, Laura, that we always kind of make a joke about like, hey, we don't really know anything. We just sit here. We're just a couple of dummies that ask a lot of questions. But it is really fun to get to sit down, you know, for 60, 90 minutes with someone who's very, very much an expert and done the 10,000 hours and is very much smarter than we are, and learn. And it's, for whatever reason, this weird little recipe, Nate, works. Like we get to learn from smart people, and Dr. Laura is one of our favorite smart people. So,
well, guys, it is fantastic to be back. I have been just so excited about getting together. So I'm super grateful. I think it's God's timing that you guys reached out to me, because I'm excited for what He wants to unfold tonight. I have to say too, maybe before we get into the thick of things is, you know, I express this to you, Luke, but one of the things that I do each time I come on with an audience, whether it's for the first time or the fifth time, is I'm always asking the Lord for the scrolls for each audience and what He wants to release, because I know I love being on the receiving end of that. You know, when I'm digging into something and I'm kind of wondering, and the Lord, I'll randomly listen to someone and the Lord just brings confirmation through what they say. And so I want to be a conduit of that. And so I'm always asking the Holy Spirit, you know, what are the scrolls for each audience? And I guess it was 2 weeks ago on March 2nd, I was on a show with Carmen Studer. It was a YouTube live stream, and it was the first time I was on her show. So a couple of days before, I was, you know, praying and asking the Lord, you know, what do you have for this audience? And for the first time, the Lord said, I want you to talk about the Khazarians. It's time to talk about the Khazarians. And I have to say that was a big deal for me, because I've written in my book, so, you know, fairly extensively, I covered the Khazarians in The Roots of the Federal Reserve, which is my book. But since then, I have not spoken about that on any platform, not even my website or my YouTube channel or anything, until on March 2nd, when the Lord's time to talk about the Khazarians. And I knew it was, you know, I wanted to wait for the Lord's timing, because as we get into it tonight, you'll see what a sensitive issue it is and what it touches. And I think just operating in the Lord's timing is so important. And I think too, with what's going on between the conflict with Russia and Ukraine, understanding the history of Khazaria will really hopefully bring some more perspective to that conflict. But so as I was thinking about getting on with you guys, one of the things that I was super excited about is that I've already laid a lot of the foundation and the groundwork, so I can actually go deeper into the history of Khazaria with you guys and your audience, because I've laid that foundation. And, one of the episodes we did, I think it was our second time together. It's called The Fed, that episode. I had talked about the connection, tracing the Nephilim agenda from, the days of Noah through the Edomites and how that connects to the Federal Reserve. Well, I didn't spend much time going from the Edomites to the Federal Reserve, but that trail leads through Khazaria. And really in the Common Era, the Nephilim agenda has been perpetuated through the Khazarian. So anyways, all that to say, I wanted to give that little bit of a backdrop because I'm excited. I feel like this is God's timing with what's going on in the world. And he really wants us to understand some more layers. And I don't know about you, but since he released me to start talking about this, there have been a ton of people that have brought forth some history on Khazaria. So I feel like I'm one of the voices in the choir. So I'm excited.
Wow.
We're excited too.
Yeah. And if you haven't listened to our first episode with you listeners, you should probably go back and listen to that one first, because I think you talked a lot about the Nephilim agenda in specific. And I think that's a very different thing that we had ever talked about on the show before, because normally we just talk about the creatures themselves, but you sort of took it to the next level in that episode and gave us more of an understanding of an entire agenda that there is still going on today. And I think you're probably going to launch into that on this episode. So I think some people might be confused if they don't go back and listen.
No, I agree, Nate. It seems very linear, right? Because we covered the Fed, and Laura, your book on the roots of the Fed is fantastic. We've had a number of people that we know over the show that went out and read it. I have a couple buddies that have and loved it, and then we went into the Nephilim host mothers and that Nephilim breeding project, and this just seems like the third chapter to that. And it's great. Yeah, like you said, I'm very excited because we have laid a bunch of groundwork. So like Nate said, if you have not listened to those yet, don't start here. Go back and get that foundational, and then we're going to do a deep dive with Laura today on things that really seem, from what I understand, it seems to intertwine those two things: the roots of the Fed, and then also the Nephilim breeding project, or the birth mothers, and all the things we've talked about on our other episodes.
Yeah, and I think Nate, you bring up a good point, and maybe what I can do just real briefly, just to make sure we're all on the same page, is I can give kind of a quick overview of the Nephilim agenda and then what Nephilim hosts are, because in what I'll unpack tonight, both of those are critical. So I still encourage your listeners to go back and listen, because I go much more in depth in those other episodes. But as far as the Nephilim agenda, it was unleashed during the days of Noah. And so it was the plan to defile the human genome through the propagation of a hybrid race, the purpose of which was to overthrow God's kingdom. And so what Satan did is, well, I should back up. So the origins of it actually go back to Genesis 3, and that is the seed war. And so what we have is, after the fall, Yahweh declared war between the seed of Eve, which is humanity, and the seed of Satan. One day, Eve's seed would crush Satan, and that was the prophetic declaration of the coming Messiah. Well, Satan's strategy then was to contaminate the seed of the woman by defiling the human genome and altering the genetic code of life. So that at that point, that's where the fallen sons of God become integral in Satan's strategy. And we can read about that both in Genesis 6, but also in the extra biblical text of the book of Enoch. And I'm sure your listeners know this part of the story well, but the fallen sons of God, they descended upon Mount Hermon, and from there they lusted after the daughters of men, then mated with them and produced the Nephilim, which was defiling the human genome. So the Nephilim are a hybrid race of giants. Now, Nephilim hosts is a term that I coined in my book, The Roots of the Federal Reserve. And so in chapter 13, what I did is I laid out this proposed criteria for the Nephilim trait. So it gives us an opportunity to discern whether or not the presence of Nephilim traits are in an individual. And I really felt this weightiness on doing that for the book. And I really think it's because the Lord doesn't want us to be deceived in thinking that Nephilim only roamed the earth during the days of antiquity. There are Nephilim hosts alive today. And so what Nephilim hosts are, they're individuals who have partnered with the spiritual forces of darkness to carry out the Nephilim agenda. So they're humans that have partnered with spiritual forces. And really, many of them are the titans of global governance. So anyways, in chapter 13, what I did is I was able to identify 4 physical traits and the 19 behavioral characteristics of Nephilim hosts. And so, in doing that, I also was able to identify that really Nephilim hosts are intent on destroying the followers of Jesus because, they cannot stand that we are created in the image of God. And so they want to destroy us. And at the same time, they want to enslave the masses through control, domination, and intimidation. And that's really what we've been seeing, in the past 2 years. I think this Nephilim agenda is real and not as much hidden. And so at the core of the Nephilim agenda is goal to strip us of our humanity. And we think about all the mitigation strategies, that we've gone through, the isolation, you can't visit, your family members if they're hospitalized. That's part of stripping us of our humanity. And when we think about the Nephilim agenda, the Nephilim agenda and the globalist agenda are serving the same end goal, and that is total domination of humanity. So it's really tyranny of the highest order. So that's kind of just to lay a little bit of framework to now dig a bit deeper. But that is the Nephilim agenda in a nutshell and what Nephilim hosts are in a nutshell.
Yeah. It's crazy because we've talked to people, a lot of guests talk about all various aspects of this, but you have more of a mission statement. You follow the Holy Spirit in terms of you feel like it's your mission to spread awareness to this, and that's what I think a lot of people get that from you, Laura, is that you are very tuned into the Holy Spirit, and that's your guiding force. And I think it's sometimes people come on our show and they're more the academic type, and when you talk about some of these topics with people, especially the New World Order, people still think it's in the conspiracy realm. They don't even believe it exists. And you're like out there, not only saying it's here, but they're doing hybrids and they're taking over and they're shutting things down and they're keeping us apart from each other and they're just stripping us of our humanity. So it's just really bold of you, and I commend you for doing it because there's still so many skeptics that you can't even convince them of the NWO. And it's really sad that a lot of Christians don't even understand these basic concepts in their Bible.
Yeah. I appreciate your encouragement. One of the things that I know God has called me to right now, this season of my life, is characterized by Ephesians 5:11. And it says, have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. And so I feel like that's the message that the Lord's given me right now, that, he had me in a time of hiddenness for 4 years while I wrote this book. And now it's time to uncover those things that he revealed as I wrote. So, and I think the other thing too, some of this stuff, as you mentioned, can get very dark. But I know one of the other things that God's called me to do is to be a distributor of hope. And so, one of the things I want to do after I go into the meat of this is I want to talk about how do we break free from this system of enslavement? And so hopefully I'll provide some hope and some steps forward as well.
Yeah. She's a hope dealer. I like it.
That's right.
I feel like we're in this time in life where war is upon you, whether you like it or not. And sort of the Lord of the Rings.
I was going to say, you sound like Tolkien. War is upon us.
I mean, that's where we are. 3 years ago, some of the stuff that's happening, people would have never imagined. And now it's every day conspiracy theories are being proven left and right, and it's upon us, and I think we feel the same way, Laura, about on Blurry Creatures. Like Luke and I kind of hopped into this. We didn't realize the Creature podcast would get us so far down the rabbit hole. But if you want to expose the darkness and you want to give people answers, I don't know, we found a little niche of trying to give people who've seen some of these terrifying things, these creatures, some context and some to make sense of it. But your whole thing is that not only are there creatures out there, but they're breeding. There's programs. There's a system.
Yes. Yeah. So you guys ready to jump in, dive in?
Ready.
Let's do it.
Right.
Let's do it.
Ready. Yeah.
Well, so one of the things I wanted to do was pick up where we left off on our second interview. And what I did in that interview is I laid out, kind of established how there are Nephilim traits in the Edomites. And just real quickly, the Horites intermingled with the giants, and then the Edomites intermingled with the Horites. And so it was plausible that these Nephilim genes were passed in the bloodline of the Edomites. Well, then if you look at scripture, you can actually find at least 3 examples of Edomites who exuded Nephilim traits. And so I talked about that in that episode. Dog, who was the head shepherd of Saul, and then Haman, from the book of Esther, and then King Herod. All of them were Edomites that exuded Nephilim traits. So what I want to do is jump off from that point and follow the Edomites. And what that entails is really looking at migration patterns and when and where they migrated and what happened. And so if we go back to the Babylonian captivity, so this is about 586 BC, when Nebuchadnezzar came in and took the Judeans into captivity, the Edomites were cheering that on. And they were always looking for ways to take advantage of Judea or the Israelites, any calamity that happened to them, they wanted to take advantage of. And so at that time, when they were taken off into captivity, what the Edomites did is they migrated north into Judea. And that was significant because Hebron actually became their capital city. So that's one migration that happened. Now, if we fast forward a little bit to the 1st century BC, there was a high priest named John Hyrcanus. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but he was one of the leaders in the Maccabean revolt. And so what he did is he actually conquered 2 cities. One is called Marissa and the other one is Dora. And they were Idumean cities. Now, as a side note, Idumea is the Greek name for Edom. So they're interchangeable. So when John Hyrcanus, when he conquered these 2 cities, what he did is he gave the Idumeans an ultimatum. He said, you either convert to Judaism or you leave this region. And that was really the first time that a high priest forced conversion on any people group. And what the Idumeans did is they actually chose to convert because they wanted to stay in that region. And so here you have this mass conversion in the 1st century BC. And what happens now is there's these mixed marriages happening between Idumeans and Judeans, to the point where even Josephus, one of the Jewish historians, he doesn't make much distinction between the Idumeans and Judeans. And so then, the Romans come into rule and they elevate the Idumeans to a place of having governmental oversight over Judea. And that's through the line of Herod. And if you remember that in scripture, it talks about Herod being half Jew. Well, that's because he was Idumean. He was an Edomite. So you have this mass conversion. You have this admixture among the Judeans where there's really no distinction between Idumeans and Judeans. And now we're heading into the fall of Jerusalem. Well, leading up to that fall of Jerusalem, there was another mass migration of Jews, but now the Jews are mixed with the Edomites, and they migrate into the Caucasus region around the time of the fall of Jerusalem. And so there's this book that I came across. One of the things, I'm a total book nerd. And, in writing the book that I did, I just did a lot of digging. And one of the books I found was from an author named C.F. Parker, and he wrote this in 1949. He wrote a book called A Short Study of the Esau, Edom, and Jewry. And what he did was he really unpacked this migration of both the Idumeans and Judeans. And so I was super grateful to come across this book. So I just want to read a couple excerpts because, again, he gives us this good understanding of what happened during this time. So he says, Armenian and Georgian historians record that after the destruction of the first temple, Nebuchadnezzar deported numbers of Jewish captives into Armenia and the Caucasus. These exiles were joined later by co-religionists from Media and Judea, Jews lived in the Crimea and along the entire eastern coast of the Black Sea at the beginning of the Common Era. Jews from Crimea moved eastward and northward and became the founders of Jewish communities along the shores of the Caspian Sea, carrying with them a civilization more advanced than that of the native tribes among which they settled. And then he goes on to say, I have indicated something of the complexity of these migratory movements, showing that right up to the last days in the bitterly contested history of the nation, large numbers of Jews migrated to or were deported into regions adjacent to the gateways into Europe through the Caucasus, through which they passed in large numbers for some centuries into the Christian era. Out of any comprehensive analysis of all the ethnic data available, there's bound to come one inescapable conclusion, that just as the Idumeans became part and parcel of the Jewish nation after the amalgamation with it in the time of John Hyrcanus, so too they became an integral part in its enforced migrations towards the Caucasus and subsequently into Central Europe, whither they carried Hellenism. So what he's saying is he's laying out that here is this migration of the Edomites and the Jews. They migrated into the Caucasus region after the fall of Jerusalem, and that area was inhabited by the Khazars. Now, the Khazars were a violent, warlike people that were from Asia, and they migrated into the northern region of the Caspian Sea around the first century BC. And they were so violent that they quickly amassed this massive territory that was nearly 1 million square miles. And that encompasses what we know today as Eastern Europe. And so it includes all of Ukraine, well, most all of Ukraine, parts of Russia and Georgia and that area. And so I think that's why, kind of diving into some of the history of Khazaria is really important, because not only will it help us understand this geopolitical conflict that's going on right now, but it also touches some of the spiritual mapping concepts that I've discussed in previous episodes. And that is like, what are the roots of defilement that are in the land of Ukraine? Is this land, in fact, a breeding ground for Nephilim hosts? So I think that's part of why it's so important to dive into that.
That's wild. It's wild to think about. I think we open the Bible and read about, the fall of Jerusalem and then the Israelites being carried off to Babylon and be enslaved, and don't really think about, at least I don't, like actually looking at a map and seeing how far some of these people groups were then spread or migrated based on the conquering of Jerusalem, the conquering of Israel. It's fascinating. It's really fascinating to think of that ethnic Jews and Israelites made it to the Caucasus Mountains and over into these areas that you just don't think traditionally, right? You think of the Holy Land. You think of, but these people were either carried off or migrated like far, far from Galilee and Jerusalem and the West Bank and all these places that we identify or sort of maybe at least I do picture being, the places you think things happen in the Bible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so I think some of the spiritual mapping concepts that I've talked about in the past, things that when there's iniquity that is in the land, it impacts the people that live there. If that iniquity has not been dealt with and cleansed from that land, what it does is it's like this magnet for defilement of the same magnitude over generations. And so, in thinking about answering that question, is Ukraine a breeding ground for Nephilim hosts? One of the questions, I think I answered it on one of your Q&As with your members, but one of the questions I often get is, what's the difference between Nephilim hosts, and then demonized people? And I think, just to kind of quickly lay out the distinction, the Nephilim are hybrids. So they're part human, part spiritual being. Nephilim hosts are humans, like I mentioned, that partner with the spiritual forces of darkness to carry out the Nephilim agenda. And then demonized people are people that have demons that reside within them, but they don't intentionally try and carry out the Nephilim agenda. And so I propose that all Nephilim hosts are demonized, but not all demonized are Nephilim hosts. So in case some of your listeners have that question as as I'm talking about these things, I just wanted to kind of clarify a little bit. But, in thinking about Ukraine, again, is it a breeding ground for Nephilim hosts because of the iniquity that was sown so many years ago, multiple millennium ago? And if that wasn't cleansed, then we have these adaptive deceptions that come generation after generation, and it really creates this breeding ground for evil. So in answering that question about Ukraine, and the Khazars, it's unfortunate that we can't really turn to history books, because history is actually curiously silent about the Khazars. So to experts that have really contributed to our understanding of the Khazarian kingdom. And one of those is a guy named Benjamin Friedman. And he was a really successful businessman back in the early 1900s. He was, he's living in New York City, and he was extremely well connected with the political elite of the time. And his perspective is actually, it's really unparalleled, because he was a Zionist operative, but he left Zionism in 1945. So if we were to think about it in today's vernacular, he's essentially a whistleblower. And when he left Zionism, he came out and really exposed a lot of where it comes from and history of the Khazars. So I just want to read an excerpt from some things that he wrote. He says, in the 1st century BC, the Khazars had invaded Eastern Europe from their homeland in Asia. They were not Semites. They were an Asiatic Mongoloid nation. In a comparatively short period, the Khazars established the largest and most powerful kingdom in Europe, and probably the wealthiest also. Then he goes on to say, the Khazars were a pagan nation. The vile forms of sexual excess indulged in by the Khazars as their form of religious worship produced a degree of moral degeneracy that the Khazar kings could not endure. In the 7th century, King Bulan decided to abolish the practice of phallic worship and selected the future state religion as Talmudism, and now known and practiced as Judaism. So here we have another example of this mass conversion to Judaism. Just like what happened with the Idumeans, now we have it happening with the Khazars. And what's interesting, he kind of lays out this connection between Talmudism and Judaism. And so there's another expert I want to pull in, and his name is Louis Finkelstein. And he actually was a prominent 20th century American Jew. He was a Talmudic scholar, and he explains the connection between the Pharisees and the Talmud. And, this is important in kind of understanding how this played out in the region of Khazaria. So anyways, he says that Pharisaism became Talmudism. Talmudism became medieval rabbinism. Medieval rabbinism became modern rabbinism. When the Jew studies the Talmud, he is actually repeating the arguments used in the Palestinian academies. So what he's saying is the Khazarian Jews, they adhered to the Pharisaical religious practices. And when King Bulan forced the conversion onto all of the Khazarians, his son, this was successor, his name was King Obadiah. And he actually brought in hundreds of rabbis to teach the Babylonian Talmud. So it really spread throughout the whole kingdom. And the Babylonian Talmud is actually what we know as the Talmud today. So there's 2 parts to the Talmud. There's the Mishnah, which is the oral law. And then there's the Gemara, which is the interpretation and commentaries on the oral law. So what rabbis believe is that the oral law was given to Moses at the same time as the written law. And Moses then passed it on to Joshua. And it's believed that Joshua passed it on. It eventually got to the prophets. And then the prophets passed it on and eventually got to these rabbis who transcribed it in 200 AD. Many, many Jews that practice Talmudism or Judaism, they actually hold the Talmud as more sacred than the Torah. Not all Jews do, but there's a large number that hold the Talmud as more sacred. So that's important to understand in this backdrop as well. But so back to this forced conversion. So we have the Edomites and the Khazarians under this forced conversion, which then really means there's more of this mixture with the Judeans. Because remember, the Judeans had migrated to this Caucasus region, and among them were the Edomites. So one of the reasons why talking about the history of Khazaria is so sensitive is because it brings up the question, who are the true Jews? Who are the true children of God? And it's a very contentious question that's, difficult to answer. And I'm not necessarily going to answer it tonight, but what I want to bring forth are things for us to consider. So I'm going to pause there because I don't know if you have questions or want to jump in with thoughts or comments.
Well, it gets kind of tricky. I've had some of these conversations with friends in the past, and they, people saying, "Oh, well, this is just another way to attack Jewish people." And I've had a lot of conversations with friends who, I don't know, these conversations are always really tricky.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't think so much about that, except for I think the Talmud thing is fascinating, right? The idea this oral law existed, and if we carry that all the way forward, then we realize that it was exactly this that Jesus raged against, or
exactly
pushed back against. What was this law, right? And it was the Pharisees always tried to trap him with the trappings of the oral law, which became written, and all these it's legalism. I mean, it's all these crazy rules you have to stick in, and Jesus turned it on its head, which it's interesting. And there's some interesting stuff too that I've read about the Khazarians, and like the idea that what I've read, and you can correct me, Laura, is that the king at the time they converted to Talmudism, Judaism, basically did like it was like a contest. It was like he brought people that were Jewish, and he brought people that were Islamic, and gosh, it may have been Christianity, and he basically put them all in like the thing and said, what are we gonna convert to? Who are we gonna be? And Judaism won out. Then you have this trajectory, right? That changes the entirety, and then like Nate's saying, then people who really care about like who is the ethnically Jewish, it becomes so muddied.
It does.
People squabble about this, right? And I don't know if it even matters, honestly, especially if we're looking at things through Jesus as we're supposed to. It doesn't matter. I mean, it matters in the sense of being God's chosen people and holding on to that, and some of the prophetic things that are specifically for Israel, but doesn't really matter in the sense that Gentiles were grafted in. So we are Jew, not Jew. We all fall under the new covenant. Anyway,
I think one of the things, Laura, that I thought about after our last episode was, we often think that these things came and went. They were here, then they weren't here. I think what you're trying to describe is that this stuff's been going on since the dawn of time. It's just kind of rebranded itself into a different version.
Yes.
But you can go back to this one and this one and this one that goes all the way back, and it hasn't really left. So the Pharisees are still kind of here in some form, basically.
Yes.
And they're still doing the same thing that they did back then. They're doing it now.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's called an adaptive deception. And, what happens is, I think we talked about this before, but, Nimrod, how he became a Gibber, became a Nephilim.
Yeah.
Well, from Nimrod, you have, all these gods that come forth, and they just change names. And his wife, Semiramis, became Queen of Heaven, Asherah, Ishtar, Diana. So these adaptive deceptions, what happens is, in a new culture, it just shifts slightly, but it's the same false worship that's taking place. And that's really what I'm trying to highlight, is that, it's happening today in Ukraine and Russia. Yeah. We really have to go back and say, okay, Lord, we have to look at this through the eyes of Scripture and through the eyes of understanding these spiritual mapping concepts, because it does affect us today, whether or not we understand that iniquity. But once we understand the iniquity, then we can enter into spiritual warfare through prayer and intercession and cleanse the land and engage in that level of warfare. So it's all tied together. And Nate, I can really appreciate what you were saying about how sensitive this is, because and that's one of the reasons why I have specifically waited for the Lord to say, okay, now is the time, because I recognize how sensitive it is. And I personally, I kind of came into this awareness of the beauty of the Hebrew feasts, the Lord's Feast, Passover, Tabernacles, and Pentecost in 2014. Oh. And, Purim is coming up. Purim is tomorrow evening, which is from the book of Esther, where they celebrate the turnaround that happened. And so I'm going to join with others locally and celebrate Purim. And so I recognize the beauty of the Hebraic roots of our faith, but yet we have to ask ourselves, who are the true Jews? And again, I'm not going to answer that tonight, but I do want to just kind of lay some things out for us to grapple with. So kind of going back to C.F. Parker, he was an author of a short study of the Esau, Edom, and Jewry. And he laid out that in there's two categories of modern Jews in the world. And most Jewish historians were in agreement when he laid this concept out. But he talks about the Ashkenazi Jews and the Sephardic Jews. And I'm going to talk more tonight about the Ashkenazi Jews because that's the connection to the Federal Reserve. But, what he says is we have to understand that there is this Edomite influence in the Ashkenazi Jews. It may be minor, but we can't overlook it. And so he writes this. He says, Ashkenazic Jewry is thus comprised of three elements of not exactly known proportions: those of Judite descent, those of Idumean origin, and then proselytes of other origins, which would then be the Khazarians. And so 2 out of the 3 elements of Ashkenazi Jews are not of Judite descent. So that's important to keep in mind. And, there's this long-standing debate between where did the Ashkenazi Jews come from? And a lot of scholars and historians believe they came from Germany. But there's actually this growing body of evidence that points to their origins are actually from Khazaria. And I'll give you just a couple of examples. So in the 12th century, there was a rabbi that kept a travel log, and he recorded on his travel log that the kingdom of Khazaria comes from the descendants of Meshach, the son of Gomer, the grandson of Japheth, the great-grandson of Noah. He writes that, but then there's confirmation in a letter from King Joseph. He was one of the kings of Khazaria, and he was answering a question in this letter. And the question was, where did he writes that the Khazars are from the bloodline of Japheth. Now, what's notable is from this bloodline also comes Magog, Togarmah, and Ashkenaz. And even in the Talmud, it speaks about a town near the Black Sea called Ashkenaz. But even more broadly, the term Ashkenaz has been used to describe the kingdom of Khazaria. And what I find interesting too is, so in the book of Ezekiel, there's actually this description of the trade practices of Meshach and Togarmah. And so I want to read it. It's Ezekiel 27:13-14. It says, Greece, Tubal, and Meshach did business with you, trading slaves and bronze for your products. Beth Togarmah traded workhorses, war horses, and mules for your products. So it's just a short, 2 passages. But again, here's this massive clue, because what it's telling us in this passage is that the ancestors of the Khazarians were slave traders, and they were warlike people who utilized horses in battle. So now if we fast forward to another one of the experts that I wanted to bring forward, and his name is Matthew Johnson. And he was a professor from Penn State. He also spent time at Mount St. Mary's, and he was a professor of history and political science. Well, he specialized in Russian and Ukrainian history. And so that really gives him, he's very well versed in the history of Khazaria. And so he writes this. He says, the Khazar theory suggests there is no connection between Israelites and Jews. Yet even if there were, the religion of the modern Jew bears no relationship whatsoever to the Israelite faith, which is vehemently condemned in the Talmud. In adopting the ethic of the Talmud, they adopted the mentality of the Pharisees, whose arrogance served as the early foundation of the Talmud. So again, he's kind of what we touched on just a few minutes ago, that here's this connection between the Pharisees and the Talmud, and this is what the Khazarians adopted. But then he also goes on to say, he wrote an essay called The Regime, Usury, Khazaria, and the American Mass. And here's where he confirms what is in Ezekiel, that passage I just read to you. And he says, in Russian history, this usury was the role of Khazaria. Charging tolls on passing merchants was their primary form of income. Domestically, the top layer of society, mostly Jewish, extracted tribute from their conquered peoples. The Khazar Empire had a small but powerful group of Jewish bankers in Kiev as early as the 10th century. Now, he goes on to say why Khazaria is not found in history books. He says, Khazaria existed as a multinational state ruled over by an oligarchy of Jewish converts. Few historians will touch this issue, and with good reason. By controlling the Great Silk Road, the Khazar Jews fully seized the trade between East and West, between North and South. That is, all the trade routes passing through the Caucasus Mountains. This was the main purpose for their migration to the region. Full control of the caravan routes passing through the Khazar Khanate allowed the Jews to establish a trade monopoly, where they began to control the prices of imported and local goods. As a result, consumers were gouged. So we can see here that here's this usury that you can see how it ties right into the masterminds of the Federal Reserve. But he goes on to say this. He says, according to the testimony of medieval travelers, the main source of income of the Khazar Khanate, except for usury, was the slave trade. Regular raids on neighboring lands, mostly Slavic, gave the Khazars a large number of slaves, which were sold all over the world. Trade in general, and the slave trade in particular, has always been the traditional source of income for the Jewish entrepreneurs and a source of super profits, which made it possible to get rich quick and further strengthen its parasitic power. So when he unpacks this, what we're seeing is now we can begin to see this long-standing corruption in Ukraine. You know, it's been this breeding ground for Nephilim hosts. So what Johnson and what Friedman talk about, this account of the Khazars, we see Nephilim traits. We see that they were violent without remorse. They engaged in sexual degradation. They were dishonest in trade and business transactions. They were traffickers of humans, and they enslaved others. So that really hopefully begins to bring to light some of this corruption. Now, just to kind of end this story, the Khazarian kingdom, they eventually in the 13th century, they were conquered by Genghis Khan's sons. And what happened then was there was this diaspora of the Khazarian Jews who were the Ashkenazi Jews, and they spread into Eastern Europe. And you would think that, you know, once the land was conquered and there was this diaspora, that the Khazarian reign would end. But actually what we find is it just spread. And it spread in all different parts of Eastern Europe. And here's where I want to link with the Federal Reserve is that the Rothschilds were Ashkenazi Jews. And you know, they're arguably the most influential Nephilim hosts of the Common Era. And so the Rothschild family and their Khazarian mafia, they really have gained a foothold in almost every country since the mid-1700s. And I touched a little bit on this in previous times, but really what happened was, so the patriarch of the Rothschild banking dynasty, his name was Mayer Amschel Rothschild, he partnered with Adam Weishaupt. Now, Adam Weishaupt was the one who instituted the Order of the Illuminati. And together they developed this sevenfold plan for world domination. And I've shared this before, but I just want to lay it out again because I want to segue to talk about how can we break free from this system of enslavement. But so their sevenfold plan was to abolish all national governments, to abolish private property, abolish inheritance. They wanted to destroy patriotism, destroy Christianity, destroy the family unit, and create one world government or a new world order. So this plan has really become the blueprint to carry out the Nephilim agenda. Create one world government or a new world order. Create one world government or a new world order. Create one world government or a new world order. Create one world government or a new
This is like, I mean, this is World Economic Forum with a heavy dash of communism.
Exactly.
You're like verbatim, like you will own nothing and you'll be happy, and then you look at the playbook of essentially, a color revolution, and it's to destroy history, destroy religion, destroy the family unit. We've seen this in people's mission statements for certain groups that we know are actively trying to bring down nation states, including ours. Mm-hmm. It's just, it's Klaus, it's World Economic Forum, like to a T.
It is. Yeah. And this was rolled out at least between the Rothschilds and Weishaupt in 1776. So that's how long this current blueprint of the Nephilim agenda has been happening. And that's why I carry this message, because it impacts every single one of us. Those of us that have children in schools, it impacts us because our kids are being indoctrinated with this in the schools.
It's so hard, Laura, because, like we talked to Tim Mackey from the Bible Project about this, and we asked him what he thought the seed of the serpent was. When you talk about this, it's like I see the whole, it's like you see all of human history. You see the whole thing. You see from the beginning till now, from the garden until now, that there's just been this crazy war that's been going on. And yet still so many educated Christians it's like they can't see that part of it. And you just wonder, like, what are all these wars in the Old Testament for? What are all these tribes? And it's fundamentally like paradoxical to a lot of Christians, because they don't understand wipe these people groups out. These people need to be exterminated from the planet. Mm-hmm. And I just don't know how people read their Bible without these fundamental storylines.
Well, you can't. You don't realize that they're hybrids. You're like, how do you, how would a just God, or how would a loving God sponsor genocide? And you're like, well, it's because they weren't human. Laura, I have a question, just a little one. Like, I'm just trying to make the connections here, because this is all making sense in regional, and also just thinking about the things you've talked about in defilement of the land and generational curses and spiritual mapping. This stuff has been happening in this space. But can you help connect the dots between the maybe I just missed it, from the Talmudic and the Pharisaic to maybe to the Nephilim host stuff? Is it the Pharisees, or that Pharisaic line is still actively working to destroy Christianity and Christ, or
yes,
is it okay? That's what I was inferring. I just wanted to connect those dots.
And I wanted to talk about how is the Vatican involved in all that too.
Oh yeah, that's a whole nother topic.
That's a whole other episode, bro.
Never mind.
Yeah, that's a deep dive too. But so I will say this, that the Rothschilds were the treasurers for the Vatican.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah. So it does all connect. And how the Talmud influences Nephilim hosts is, again, through the Khazarians, because the Khazarians were, when that mass conversion happened, they went and implemented the Talmud in every part of society. And so, that is the Pharisaical teaching, like you said, Luke, that Jesus raged against. And so here we have this Talmud that kind of guided the Khazarians. And then we have the Rothschilds being Ashkenazi Jews, being Khazarians, and then how that feeds on down the line. And we've talked about that in previous episodes of connecting the Rothschilds to the Federal Reserve. But I definitely want to, because this stuff is so heavy and it's so sensitive, like I said, I want to bring forth ways that we can break free from this system of enslavement, because we are never without hope. And that's the beautiful thing of walking with Jesus, is we are never without hope. So I want to just share along those lines, if that's okay, kind of diving into how do we break free from this? Okay. So, as a psychologist, I'm trying to also raise awareness of the mind control that has really come over our generation. In fact, I'm working on my next book. I'm hoping to call it Generation Hoodwinked, and really looking at how have we become so hoodwinked. So many people we know just buy the narrative hook, line, and sinker. And it's really because of mind control tactics of the Nephilim hosts. And, if we think about just, the situation with Russia and Ukraine, we have been conditioned to believe through mainstream narrative that Russia is bad. In fact, as long as I've been alive, Russia has always been the bad guy, when we think about it. And I'm not saying that Putin is some saint, but I think what we have to realize is what gets communicated to us about war is propaganda. And that's been happening for centuries. We've been consistently lied to by the media and by elected officials. So if we don't do our own research and we don't use critical thinking skills, then we just fall right into the trap. And I heard a quote the other day from George Orwell. So many of us have read 1984, but this actually comes from an essay that he wrote in 1943. And it's called Looking Back on the Spanish War. So he fought in the Spanish Civil War, and he fought against the Franco-led fascists. And so this essay is a reflection of his experiences in that war. And he says this. He says, history stopped in 1936. Now, that was the beginning of the Spanish Civil War, just so we all understand that. So he says, history stopped in 1936. He says, early in life, I have noticed that no event is ever correctly reported in a newspaper. But in Spain, for the first time, I saw newspaper reports which did not bear any relation to the facts, not even the relationship which is implied in an ordinary lie. I saw great battles reported where there had been no fighting, and complete silence where hundreds of men had been killed. I saw troops who had fought bravely denounced as cowards and traitors, and others who had never seen a shot fired hailed as the heroes of imaginary victories. And I saw newspapers in London retailing these lies, and eager intellectuals building emotional superstructures over events that had never happened. I saw, in fact, history being written, not in terms of what happened, but of what ought to have happened according to the various party lines. This, I think, really captures what is happening to us. This is just one example of how lies are perpetuated during wartime propaganda. And so, again, when we think about breaking free from the system of enslavement, it starts with breaking free from mind control. And, if we think about, who is supporting Ukraine right now and vilifying Russia? We've got
75% of the media.
Right. DC Swamp. We've got mainstream media, and then we've got the woke populace that loves to virtue signal. And so, we kind of ask ourselves, are these really the people that we want to trust? These are the same people that stripped us of our liberties for the sake of flattening the curve, or they censored us because we began asking about the quote unquote science. And so, if I use my critical thinking skills, what it leads me to is that this narrative that's being played out for us regarding Ukraine is probably most likely not even accurate. And, last week, I don't know if you guys follow Monsignor Carlo Maria Vigano. I don't know if you've ever read any of his stuff, but he used to have a very high position in the Catholic Church over the United States. And now he's not, but he writes these letters or these declarations that have massive truth bombs in them. And so I just want to read an excerpt. He just last week released his declaration regarding the Russia-Ukrainian crisis. And he says this, he says, the censorship being imposed against Russian broadcasters is clearly aimed at preventing the official narrative from being disproven by the facts. But while the Western media shows images of the video game War Thunder, frames from the movie Star Wars, explosions in China, videos of military parades, footage from Afghanistan, the Rome Metro, or images of a mobile crematoria, by passing them off as real and recent scenes of the war in Ukraine, reality is ignored because it has already been decided to provoke a conflict as a weapon of mass distraction that legitimizes new restrictions of freedoms in Western nations, according to the plans of the World Economic Forum's Great Reset and the United Nations Agenda 2030. Boom. That
dang.
Yeah.
I've been Laura. I've been saying the same thing you've been saying though. It's like everybody who's aligned on one side of this is the same people who completely went and supported all of our liberties taken away. That it's like all the baddies are on one side, and it's hard not to be like, hey, so you're going to believe these people that lied to you for 2 years? Now they're giving you the real reporting, but it's like there's this massive. And Dr. Robert Malone talked about this, is this mass formation psychosis. Mm-hmm. It's like everyone's under a spell.
Yes.
Yeah.
And they're not even giving you real footage. It's video game or simulator right. or a different time or pictures from 2 years ago. Yeah. And they're pushing this narrative. And it's like now it's like anytime that anything's pushed at you, I'm like, okay, that's probably not true. It's 100% worth looking into.
It's like the opposite. Whatever's mostly being pushed, the opposite is probably true.
Right. or somewhere in the shades of gray of that, right? It's.
Well, it sounds like Putin's not a one world order guy. I mean, who knows?
Yeah, Putin actually kicked out the Rothschild Central Bank from his country several years back. So that right there tells us something about Putin, that he's not part of this cabal system. Now, again, I'm not saying that Putin is a saint and what he's doing is right, but again, we have to use those critical thinking skills. And I'm sure you guys have noticed that we've moved from fear of COVID to fear of nuclear war now. Just like what Vegana was saying, it's this weapon of mass distraction. And it's because they want to roll out, their agenda that I talked about that was developed in 1776. And, one of the things as a psychologist that I try and really bring forward is the fact that fear is the ultimate driver of mind control. And so, when Nephilim hosts can control our mind through all this fear porn that's being put out through mainstream media, when they control our mind, they've captured us. We lose our sense of sovereignty as an individual. And that's why I say, breaking free from the system of enslavement starts with breaking free from that mind control. And, they love to tell what they're doing, the Nephilim host. And I'm going to give another quote. This one is by Henry Kissinger in 1992, and it describes the agenda that they use. It says, today's Americans would be outraged if UN troops entered Los Angeles to restore order. Tomorrow, they will be grateful. This is especially true if they were told there was an outside threat from beyond, whether real or promulgated. Catch that. He's admitting whether real or promulgated, that threatened our very existence. It is then that all peoples of the world will plead with world leaders to deliver them from this evil. The one thing every man fears is the unknown. When presented with this scenario, individual rights will be willingly relinquished for the guarantee of their well-being granted to them by their world government.
Dang.
I mean, Nate, this is what we talked about, though. I think this is why some people, and I tend to lean this way, think that the cherry on top of this is going to be this alien encounter or exposure, and that we're going to need to be saved from. It's this common enemy.
The lies of Eden. repeated.
It is. It's
and that's the thing that people don't understand. It's always going to be the lie of Eden. It's going to be twisted in some way, but it's always going to be this moral obligation. You have to give up everything, or you don't really love humans. It's always going to be packaged in a way that's it's eat the fruit.
Yeah.
You're gonna want to give up your freedoms. You're gonna want to give up your rights.
Well, and I think the tragedy too is that more than likely both sides are bad, but the collateral damage is regular people that fight the wars to line the pockets and bank accounts of the elite.
Yeah,
it's Iraq, it's Afghanistan, we have all the blood in our hands here. I think in the States as well. Like none of these things are ever what they're said to be, and it's always working class normal people that pay the price, their sons and daughters, and it's disgusting. It's like but back to what you say, it is the agenda. It's the destruction of humans. It's the annihilation of humans. That's the end game. You can talk about like the wealth and the resources and the asset and all those things that these individuals and these elite and oligarchs are trying to control and access and hold. But the end of it is like the most sinister part of all that is that they're serving, a master that wishes for their complete annihilation.
Yeah.
And, Laura.
Yeah.
I liked that quote, Orwell quote about, there's no news after 1938, I think you said. And
1936, yeah.
36, yeah. And it kind of reminds me of what we talked about a lot on our show, Luke, that's when newspapers stopped reporting digging up giant skeletons.
Yeah.
Around that time, you see this, there was newspapers were reporting the truth of what things were going on. And then right around the early 1900s, it just all stops.
1930, you get no more.
Yeah,
it was
no
all
more.
It was all kind of gone.
And then you hear stories of like churches covering up discovery of actual Nephilim creatures too. And it makes you wonder, the people who are in this Nephilim agenda, this Rothschild New World Order, it's like they're the ones almost trying to keep the truth of them, of their own existence until when, Laura? Until the end, until when they finally have control, and then we find out, and then alien disclosure, and then it's like they're trying to keep everything hush hush until the great reveal, the great reset, the great moment. What do you think?
Yeah, I do. I don't think they want it revealed now, but God does. And that's why we're talking about this stuff, because we're equipping ourselves to combat this fear. And, they want to keep us trapped in fear, because when we live in fear, our ability to process nuanced information is impaired. So we're more likely to blindly follow others without using critical thinking skills. And fear can quickly become a stronghold in our lives. And when that happens, we lose our identity, we lose our inheritance, we lose our destiny. And, we can go back to the example in scripture where the Israelites believed the bad report from the 10 spies. They chose to fear the giants and they lost their inheritance. They weren't able to set foot in the land of promise. And that's what happens when a stronghold of fear comes over you. And, I was thinking about this strongholds and how do we break those strongholds over us? And I came across Ed Silvoso. He's an Argentinian evangelist, and he has a definition that I really like that helps us understand what a stronghold is. He says it's a mindset impregnated with hopelessness that causes us to accept as unchangeable situations that we know are contrary to the will of God. And so we cannot have hopelessness set in, because that's when that stronghold, that fear just settles on us. And, one of the things I wanted to point out is most often fear is a big fat liar. When we think about things that, maybe we wouldn't engage in because we think are too risky, when you look at the actual risk of those behaviors, most often it's really low. And there's media, of course, plays this huge role. They will roll out stories that determine whether or not we think something is risky or not. And if we go back to think about COVID-19, when mainstream media had the death tolls always on the screen, that was heightening people's perception of this risk of dying from COVID. And so psychologists refer to it as the availability heuristic, but essentially what it is when we make decisions based on information that's readily available in our memory. So when stories are told over and over again that create fear, then that sticks out in our head, and we make decisions based on that. And, there's some fascinating research on this topic. And there's this professor of psychology from Oregon. His name is Dr. Paul Slovic. And he actually has done a ton of research on our perception of risk. And his findings kind of overall highlight the fact that people's perception of risk is actually not even close to reality. And so I'll just give you one example. He says, in one of his findings, 80% of his participants believe that you're more likely to die from accidental death than from a stroke. But in reality, stroke kills twice as many people than all accidental deaths combined. And so, as we think about all that's going on in the world, I want to encourage us not to make decisions based on our perception of risk, or based on what mainstream media is feeding us, or through that voice of fear that lies to us. Instead, we should assess situations based on the word of God. And I just kind of, to wrap up tonight, I have a couple of scriptures that I often go to, when I'm faced with a situation that I can feel fear wanting to pounce on me. And one of them is Deuteronomy 31:6. And I love this verse because it's Moses telling the Israelites, the next generation that's about to go into the land of promise. And he says this, he says, be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or terrified because of them. Well, the them are the giants that their parents feared. And so Moses is saying, don't be afraid or terrified because of them. For the Lord your God goes with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. I love that passage. Another one that really helps me is Romans 8:31. And it says, what then shall we say in response to these things? So I think about our situation right now in the world. What should we say in response to gas prices going up, to inflation now above 10%? What shall we say to the threat of nuclear war, or to World War III, or, the list goes on and on and on. And that passage says, if God is for us, who can be against us? And it goes on to say, in all these things, we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. For I am convinced that neither death nor life, neither angels nor demons, neither the present nor the future, nor any powers, neither height nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus our Lord. So no matter what we face, we can overcome because Jesus promises to always be with us. And the last one that I think about often is Philippians 1:21, which says, for to me, to live is Christ and to die is gain. And so I just wanted to encourage us, as crazy, it seems like the world gets crazier as each month passes. And we're going to have, all these distractions like the Ghana was talking about that are going to come at us. So when the battle in Russia and Ukraine simmers down, we might have war break out between China and Taiwan. Yep. There's always going to be something. But again, going back to assessing our situations and the decisions we make by the word of God, and not letting fear and mind control rob us of our destiny.
Amen. I love it. Yeah. Laura, it makes me think about some things we talked about with you before in our frequency war episode about just how fear is like one of the lowest frequencies, right? And that
yes,
and that love is like one of the highest, and then you see that perfect love casts out all fear.
Yes,
and that's what Jesus came to do, and I think that's the encouragement too, is that to combat fear is to come in a posture or a place of love, right? And the source of that is Jesus, and that's where we can find I think the truth, and that's where I keep coming back to is that God is going to show us the truth, and He is the way, the truth, and the life, and he is also love. And those are the two things that fundamentally cancel out or push back fear.
Absolutely.
And yeah, I mean, I just think this is such an important message. And it's fascinating to me too that like this geocentric conflict right now is geocentric on this place we just talked about, which is and has been a breeding ground for the Nephilim. And so we go all the way back again to Genesis 3. The seed war continues. I mean, the flood didn't wipe out the Nephilim, Nate. We talked about this. We have the Rephaim after. And do you think the enemy in his one scheme, even though he failed at stopping the Messiah, do you think that he would stop in his or the darkness, not giving too much credit to Satan, but the darkness and the rebellion would stop? No, they're going to continue to try to destroy the thing that and that's us, that walks, talks, and lives with the image of the living God upon us, right? Like there are forces that want to destroy and destroy us and wipe us off the planet, and I think that the longer I live and the less of these last 2 or 3 years, it becomes so blatantly obvious. I mean, it's crazy. I think more people have gotten red pilled in this last 3, 4, 5 years because of just the exposure. It's like all of a sudden you realize, man, like I just started looking backwards and realizing like how much I was younger and a kid, but you bought into, to the war in Iraq and to these different things that happened. And you're like, dude, these were it's all planned and all lies and countless people died. People we know died and laid their lives down, thought they were fighting for something that was something that wasn't. Yeah, man.
Laura, it makes me think that throughout this episode that there's two things I think Satan really wants to do. He either wants to convert you, he wants to convert you to a corrupted abomination, or he wants to kill you. He really wants to do those two things. So he hates your image, so he wants to get in your head, get you to be so afraid. And what do you know? Suicide was just outrageous last year, and or ultimately, well, if I can't get people to do that, then I'm going to convert them. And I think we were just talking to Doug Hamp about that. That ultimately he's going to try to people are going to go to the transhumanism. They're going to convert themselves into something else other than God's image. And we were just talking to Dark Waters, Luke, about the fear that these cryptid creatures, when people see them, it's like the less you fear them, they don't have any power. They don't have any control in the moment. And these things are just trying to terrify us. Whether it's some sort of demonic creature in the woods or it's the news media.
Well, it's the control. Like we looked at what happened in the last 2 years. The entirety of the world's population was controlled by fear of something they could not see. And
you turn it off and you don't even know.
Man. It's like it's like Signs, bro. It's like Signs was a scary movie until they showed the aliens, and Joaquin Phoenix and his baseball bat. But like I always say, I liked that movie till they showed the aliens, and you're like, it's not as scary. And I think there's something to that where you go, and this is a really bad analogy, but there's something to be said for propagating the fear of something you can't see, something that's unknown, right? And I think we watched this happen in the last 2 years. And and then they bait and switch, and now it's the new thing. And here's you need to be afraid of the end of democracy and nuclear winter and what fill in the blank with the narrative. And it's a bait and switch, man. Wait until this one wears out and the truth comes out, because the truth is going to come out, and then they have to pull the next one, whatever the next thing is. It's China and Taiwan, or here comes the next pandemic. And I just, man, Laura, I love that you always end these conversations with encouragement, because I do think that like when these places that we tread, you and Nate and I are dark places, and I know that you feel like you're called to push back the darkness, and I know that Nate and I feel like we are also called to expose the darkness in this space, and it's a heavy space, but I love that you always leave us with encouragement, because it's great to remember that in all this darkness and all these schemes that we're exposing, that the end is already written.
That's right.
That our God defeated death, came out of the grave, took the keys, and he's already won. And at some point we get to be in Eden, with our Father, and there's hope there, right? And there's hope for the end, and there's also hope for for the in between, and I don't think that's lost. Right? There's hope here.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
Psalm 23 is my favorite psalm. Thinking about more and more as we talk about the giants on this show, and when you really begin to understand when he's talking about the valley of the shadow of death, what he's really describing, some of these places where these giants were everywhere, and how hard it must have been not to be afraid, but to remember that God went with them and delivered them time and time again. It's just as I get older and we uncover more truths on this show, how much more those verses mean to me. So thanks, Laura, for encouraging us and schooling us, and
schooling us.
It's weird what a Creatures podcast will get into. It's been going on. It's still there. It's in the shadows a little bit more now, but these topics are, the giants are still here in some form.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We don't realize that, but the more you pull back and you take the fear glasses off, you can start to see, oh, yeah, I don't have to be afraid. This is all like manufactured.
And the Fed printed $8 trillion. So we could all talk about all that at another time, Laura. We live in a wild time. It is.
We do.
It is crazy.
Yes. Well, thank you guys for having me. It's always a joy to be with you.
Thanks so much for being with us and spending time with us. It's fantastic.
Yeah, and if you haven't bought Laura's book, go buy Laura's book.
Yeah, Laura, tell us about, and you mentioned before we started a few things about that you're working on, and some platforms.
I did. I started a YouTube channel called No Longer Enslaved, and I'm in the midst of a 10-part series called The Impact of the Nephilim Agenda Today. And so for your listeners, if you want to go deeper into some of the stuff that we've talked about, you can find me on YouTube. I also have a Rumble station. Same name, No Longer Enslaved. And then you can always find my book on my website, which is nolongerenslaved.com. It's The Roots of the Federal Reserve, or it's also available on Amazon. And on my website, not only do I talk about the Nephilim, but I also do monthly articles on things like COVID-19, health and wellness. I do a lot on family advocacy, globalism, the Federal Reserve, those types of things. So you can connect with me through my website if you want to reach out.
Well,
that's awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Laura.
You're the best. We love you. We love having you on. We love I like just sitting here and learning. It's thanks for talking about this and spending time with us talking about this, because I know that this has been something that, like you said in the beginning, that you want to talk about and you feel like you're released to, and so we're honored to be a place that you chose to talk about it. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
Well, again, thanks for the opportunity, guys.
Yeah.
All right.
Stay on the trail.
Stay blurry. Well, thanks, Laura.
Yeah, you bet.
Thanks, Laura.